So I want to talk about starting to build out the scene a little bit, and then we'll look at a couple of different things that can help us prototype. So I've got this floor, and I want to kind of like create some walls to start building a little room. And so one thing that's easy to do is to duplicate objects, but the objects kind of are connected. So I'll show you how that works. And I also want to turn snapping on. So when I've got this base mesh here for my floor, I want to see that it's 10 by 10. And so if I use snapping, it's going to help me kind of make it easier to move things around. And so you might want to change the translate snap, that's the position, to different things. I think 1 is fine for what I'm going to do because we're working in kind of a small space, but you could use a bigger unit. So what I'm going to do first is I want to keep my floor organized. So I'm going to make kind of like a little position node. So it's not going to be a mesh. It's just going to be a node that I'm going to use to organize this particular part. So I'm going to make a basic 3D node. And I'm going to call this room. And I'm going to put my room stuff in here. When I added it, it added it as a child of the floor. I don't want that, so I'm just going to drag it up like this so that now it's just a child of the example. It's kind of on its own. And then I'm going to put the floor in there. So if I want to parent something to another node, I can drag it and I'll see a little square like that. And now it's part of that node. And so now if I move the floor, it'll move everything inside of it. And that's going to be useful as we start to add more stuff in here. Okay. So then I'm going to take the floor and I'm going to duplicate it. So I can do this by hitting Command D, or I can right click on the mesh and I can say duplicate. And I'm going to call this wall 1. And so what I'm going to do, I have snapping on, and I'm going to move this over here, and I'm just going to rotate it around. So I can rotate it like this, or I can go to the mesh and I can change the dimensions. It doesn't really matter how you do it at this point. I like to kind of change the dimensions. That's my kind of preference, but it's, either way is fine. So what I'll do is, because right now I'm moving on the Z axis, so I'll kind of move it over here, and then I'll keep X at 10 because I'm moving on Z. So I'll change Z to 1. And one thing is you'll notice that it changed both of my meshes. So Bree ran into that issue earlier. Everybody's going to run into that issue eventually if you duplicate stuff. So if you want to make this mesh unique so that you can change the size of this mesh without affecting the original mesh, is you just go and make unique. And so when you duplicate a mesh, to save on the computer memory, it just makes a copy of that mesh. It doesn't make a new mesh. And so those those instances are still linked. But if I click make unique, now I can hit Z equals 1 here, and it doesn't affect this one. So now I'll move this back over here. And I'll line it up at the edge here. I actually can't quite line it up because the center of the mesh is in the middle. So maybe I can change my snap to 0.5. And so now I can line it up. So if you want to be really precise, you may need to change the measurements. The reason I have to use 0.5 is because the mesh draws from the middle. And so since the mesh is 1 unit wide, the middle is at 0.5. Another way to do it, actually, maybe it's better if I just keep this at 1, just keep some nice whole numbers. And then I'll use, I'll set the Z to 2. Okay. Oh, no, I'm still 1 over. Oh, but I think because I didn't reset the position. Whoops. Yeah. So let's set that to -6. Okay. Okay, now I can line that up. I might change that later, but for now I think that's fine. Okay, so now I can make this wall taller. So I'll make the Y maybe like 8. And so notice that it draws from the middle. So it goes down and up. That's just kind of like the default way that a mesh works. So I can move it up here, and it's going to be kind of, you can see it's kind of aligned in the middle right there, because everything draws from the middle. So I can line it up there. You know, I can kind of move it around and get it where I want it. Okay, so now I've got a wall, and it's easy to just kind of go from here. So I can just take this wall and duplicate it and drag it over here. And so now I've got 2 walls. It's actually a little taller than maybe I want it, so maybe I'll do like 4, and then I'll move this down. And so notice with the snapping on, it just moves exactly to these units, and so I'm not kind of like guessing where I want it to go. Okay, so now I've got a couple walls. Let's make the other walls on the side. And so I could duplicate the walls and rotate them, or I could duplicate the original floor and move that around. There's different ways that I could approach it. I'll just take this wall and duplicate it, and then I'll just rotate it. And I'll move it over here and over, whoops, over here. Okay, so now I can just duplicate that and move it over here. So I didn't have to make that one unique because I'm not actually changing the mesh. I'm just rotating it and repositioning it. Yeah. Command D or right click and duplicate. Or Control D on Windows. To make unique, go to the mesh here, and then click on this little drop down, and then at the bottom there's make unique. Yeah. Okay, now I've got a little room, so that's cool. I'm gonna leave this for now. So now I can collapse this room. So the nice thing about using a little node like this is now I can move the whole room around. Instead of having to move everything at the same time, I can also lock this and group it, and now I can't click on it. So I can edit other things, and it won't affect the room. The room will stay the same. So I'm gonna lock it and group it, and then I'm gonna add some other stuff, and then if I wanna edit the room later, I'll come back. Okay, so let's add some little scenery. I'm just gonna add some goofy little trees in here, just to have something to look at. So I'm gonna make a new node, and I'll just start with a regular node 3D, and I'll call this trees. So I'll put all of my trees in here, but my trees are also gonna be nodes, so I'm gonna add another node 3D. There's a lot of creating extra nodes, because it's nice to keep things organized. It helps you a lot in the long run. And so when I'm making stuff, I tend to think, okay, I want a thing, and I'm going to have multiple ones of that thing, so I'm going to make a node to hold all of the copies of the thing, and then I have a node to hold the thing. So in my tree node, I'm going to have 2 meshes. So I'll add a mesh instance, and I'm going to have a tree trunk. And so for my tree trunk, I'll probably use a cylinder. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's throw a material on there just so it looks like something, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the material. So I'll just throw a gray material on there. Whoops, what did I do? Let's move this guy up here. And let's throw this gray material on there. There we go. Okay. So I've got my little tree. I'm going to make the radius a little smaller. So this isn't a smaller, in meters, this is pretty small. So I'm going to do like 0.1 meters. So it's pretty small. You could also use the sliders here. Okay. And then we can raise it up a little bit more. I don't really care if it's like, you know, overlapping with the other mesh. That doesn't really matter that much right now. Maybe I'll make it a little taller. I'll make it 3 meters tall. Okay, so that's the tree trunk. That's pretty good. Let's add some leaves. So I'll go back to my main tree node. So I'm not adding this as part of the trunk. I'm adding it as part of the main tree node. So I'm going to add another mesh instance. And, you know, I'll call this leaves or whatever. It's not going to look really like a tree, but it'll just kind of approximate it. So let's use a sphere. So we could use a sphere, or maybe a torus would be kind of funny. Let's use a torus. That might be kind of fun. A torus is like a little donut. So I've got this torus. Let's bring this guy up here. And let's bring him like that. That's kind of funny. Okay, let's make it a little smaller. So I'm gonna make the inner radius smaller and the outer radius smaller. Oh, I guess I want to make the inner radius larger. There we go. So this doesn't really look like a tree anymore, but that's fine. And I'll make the outer radius like that. That's kind of cool. Let's throw a different material on here. And there we go. That's our tree. It doesn't really look like a tree, but that's what we're going to call a tree. Maybe this is what trees will look like in the future. Okay. So I could spend more time on this, but I just kind of want to, you know, show this as an example. So now I've got this tree, and I want to duplicate it, and now I can move multiple trees. And these guys are still all connected. So if I move this tree over here, I can change the position or rotate. But if I go back to this trunk over here, and I change the size, notice that both sizes are going to change. So that might be good. Maybe you want all your trees to look the same, and if you want to make changes to the tree, you can do that. So you could make that unique, or you could just leave it as is. Maybe I kind of like having the top a little bit higher than the bottom, or sorry, wider. So I could do that, and so that kind of looks interesting. It's not really a tree, but it's kind of an interesting looking visual. So let's make a couple more copies. I'm just going to hit Command D and drag this over here. And hit Command D, drag this guy over here, and there we go. So now I've added a lot of geometry, I've added a lot of stuff in the into my scene, but my scene is still nice and organized. So I can find everything really easily. It's all right here. So obviously you could do this without any folders or nodes. You could just have lots of stuff in there. And then, you know, sometimes it's still easy to find stuff. You can use the filter to find stuff. So if I wanted to find all the trunks at the same time, I could type in trunk, and it'll just show me, you know, what's a trunk. So you can use the filter to find stuff, but I tend to kind of like organize things like this. Okay, so that's kind of a basic example of how I might get started, kind of like building out a scene. Just adding components and then, you know, making copies or making new components. You don't have to just make copies of stuff. You could make original items, but that can speed up the process a little bit. So let's add a couple things and then we'll do some documentation. So right now we're just building the scene, but we aren't able to actually interact with anything in the scene. So that's why we have the template. We can add a player in here and get to interact in the scene pretty quickly. So the template is for you guys to be able to do that without having to add a bunch of stuff on your own. So I'm going to add a player in here, and we'll add a couple other things. So I'm going to click on the main node. I'm going to lock my trees, and I'm going to go to my main node. And to add the player, to add other scenes, so the player is itself a little scene. Actually, let's take a look at that. So in scenes, inside components, there's a player scene. And the player looks like this. It's just a camera, a collider, which we haven't talked about, but we will in a moment. And then some audio that goes along with the player. There's a jump sound and a footstep sound. I don't know why the footstep sound is over there, but whatever. And And so this is just a little player that you can like drop into a scene. And we'll talk more about like making components like this next week. But that's a big part of using Godot and game design in general, is making components that you can put in different scenes. So you can have lots of different scenes and levels, but they all use the same player. So we just use one player component and we drop it into different levels. That way, if we make changes to the player, all of the players update, not just one instance. So to add a scene into another scene, I just click this link button, which is the instantiate child scene. Instantiate is just a fancy word for make a copy of. And so I'm just going to choose the player and click open. And the player is going to be kind of stuck down here. I'm going to drag the player up a little bit. Make sure it's above this floor mesh so they're not overlapping. And so the player has a camera connected to it, which I need to be able to actually see the scene when I run it. So now we can actually run the scene and play with it, but we've got a couple issues that are going to be very obvious from the beginning that we'll fix. A couple other things with the player, you'll notice there's some properties over here. You can set the player's speed, acceleration, the jump height, and how fast the camera moves. So there's a few properties you can play with the player. Okay, so I'm going to run the scene. I'm going to use this scene run current scene button. You might think that you want to use this big play button, but that's the run project, and you can use that, but you have to select the scene that's the main project scene. We haven't done that yet. So I'm just going to use the run current scene. And so it's going to load for a second. Hopefully. Okay, yeah. Okay, so you'll notice a couple things. My player just fell through the whole scene. And then you also might have noticed that this scene is very dark. So we're going to fix those things, and then that'll be it. A couple of useful key commands. For running the scene, you can hit Command R, and that'll just run the scene. And then if you want to get out of the scene, you can hit Command period, and that will stop the scene. Or Control if you're on Windows. Okay, so what? Command and period. Okay, so we don't want our player to fall through the scene. So this is a whole big topic that we'll talk a lot about later in the semester, but what we need are colliders. Colliders are parts of our game engine that know where things are in space and prevent things from occupying the same space. And so it recreates the concept of like physical collision in the real world. If you try to walk into a wall, your matter and the wall's matter can't occupy the same space, so you won't be able to walk through the wall. So in our simulation in the game engine, we have to simulate the idea of a collision, and we do that using a collision shape. So one of the things that is challenging to kind of get when you're first making a 3D game, or a 2D game for that matter, is that the art of what you're looking at and the shape of what you're colliding with are not the same thing. And that's a good thing because you can have very complicated art and have a very simple collider, and that makes the game run better and the performance better. If you have very, very complex math to do your collisions, your game is not going to run very well. So we want simple colliders and more complex art. So we obviously need to add collisions to the walls and floor. And there's different ways to do this. In Godot, there's a really easy way to do this. It's not the most efficient way, but it's a simple, quick way. If you click on this mesh menu in the main window, there's an option to create a collision shape. And what that does is it just takes whatever object you have selected and it makes a collider out of it. This is really easy to do with simple geometry like a box. There's no reason not to do this. You don't want to do this with more complex geometry like what we'll have later in the semester when we start working with other 3D models. But for now, I'm just going to create a collision shape, and I've got a couple of options. I can create a sibling that'll just make another node that's a collision shape, and it won't add any functionality to it. You can do that, but then you'll have to modify it. But I can also add a static body child. A static body is a type of collider that doesn't let things pass through it. So that's exactly what we want to use. So I'm going to change this to static body child, and then I'm going to leave the collision shape type to tri-mesh. This just means it's going to make a geometry out of triangles. So then when I click create, you'll notice that I have a new static body 3D with a collision shape. So if I turn off the floor for a second, and I'll turn off my walls as well, just so we can focus on this. Now I have this static body 3D. Let's turn off my trees for a second as well. And a collision shape. Oh, I guess it, okay. I guess I have to have these on. So you can see the blue outline is the collision shape. So the collision shape is the geometry, like the mesh that defines where the collision happens. The static body is the thing that says, take this shape and don't let things pass through it. So it makes it static. And with those things together, we'll be able to run into the floor. So let's test that and see if that really works. No, it doesn't. Okay. Let's see. There might be an issue. Let's double check something. Okay. So yeah, this is a good thing to cover right now. In Godot and most game engines, we have collision layers. And collision layers are just a way of telling which objects to collide with other objects. And so the default layer for our player is the first layer, because the player interacts with the most things. And you can see we have set up different layers for different stuff. So one of our layers is platforms. So if we want our player to run into a platform, we have to tell it that it's a platform. So if we go back here to our static body, we just need to set this layer to platform and turn off the player layer. And we can see with the mask, that's what it's looking for, is player, so that's good. So if we run the scene again, now my player lands on the floor. But I can still pass through the walls because we haven't added all of our collisions yet. But I can jump and I can walk on the floor, so that's good. Okay, so one thing to notice when you use this method of creating a static body and a collision shape is that it's going to be created based on the shape of your mesh as it is. If you change the mesh, the collision shape will not change. So what I mean by that is if I take the floor and decide later, you know what, I want the floor to be larger, I'm gonna make the Z 40. Now it looks like my floor is bigger, but if you can see those blue lines, the collision shape did not change. So if I run my scene again, and I walk over here, I'm gonna fall through the floor. So if you change your mesh, you need to update your collision shape. So what I'll do is just delete the static body, click on the floor again. I'm gonna reset this because I don't want it to actually be that size, but I want to do the example. And I'm just gonna create a new collision shape. It's still got the basic settings that I had, so I'm just gonna click create. Okay, so that's nice. Now I can do that with my walls. If I was planning ahead, I might have done this with the first wall just to save a little time, but it's not too much work to just create a static body for each one of these. Okay, so now if I run my scene, whoops, oh, I forgot, whoops, okay, I forgot you have to remember to set the collision layer to 2 for each one of these. This is a very common mistake. Like, a lot of the time when stuff doesn't work, it's because the collision layers are not set correctly. So each static body has to be on layer 2, and it has to be looking for layer 1. Okay. There's no meaning. I just assign them to random stuff in the... this is something that's part of the project setting. It's not a Godot default. But I just chose different layers for different types of objects. And so the reason I have player as 1 is because most things are going to be looking for the player. And so the default in Godot is for both the layer and the mask to be 1. So it just saves you a little bit of time when you create something new. But you have to set the right layers for the different objects. Yeah. What? Oh, so click on the main room node and click the link button, and you should see player, and you can just click open. All right. So now we can run into the walls and the ground, but you've also noticed that the lighting in the scene doesn't exist. So we're going to talk about lighting and stuff in a few weeks. But for now, what we can do is just add the default lighting. So there's scene lighting for the editor, just so you don't have to add it just to start editing. And you can make these your actual scene lights. So if you click on this drop down and you add the sun to the scene, it adds this nice light. And then if you add the environment to the scene, it adds a nice little world environment with some fog and some other stuff. So now we have lights, and we can walk around in our little room. And let's bring our trees back. And so you'll notice with the trees, they don't have colliders, so I can just walk right through them. And the player's a lot bigger than I remembered it being. I thought this scene was a lot bigger than it turns out it is, but that's okay. So these are more like bushes, but whatever. So you can see I can walk through these. If you want stuff to be scenery and you don't care if the player can walk through it, that's fine. But if you want it to block the player, you can just add a mesh like we just did. So I can go to one of our trees, and I'll just go to the trunk, and let's add a collision shape. Same thing. Notice that this collision shape is a lot more complex because the cylinder geometry is a lot more complex. With a simple scene like this, that's not the end of the world because there's not that much happening in the scene. But this isn't really ideal if you have like a very complex scene with lots of geometry, because the more geometry you have for your physics, the more work the computer does to process the physics. So you don't really want this complex of a geometry for something that's this simple. For now, we're just going to leave it because we have a very simple scene. But in the future, we'll go over how to make your collision shapes better. This only added to the one trunk. Even though the mesh is linked in all of my trees, it doesn't add stuff when I add stuff. So if I want this to happen for every tree, I have to do it for every tree. I'm not going to do that just to save time, but I will click on the static body and make sure it's on the right layer. So for the layer for this, I'm just going to use platforms again. And so now one of my trees I'll run into, but most of them I won't. I think maybe it's this one. No, maybe it's that one. No, it's this one. Okay. I can't really tell. I think it's this, no. There it is, okay. So you can see now I can't just like walk through this tree, I run into it. So it has a simple collider on it. The rest of my trees I can still just run through. All right, so very, very simple scene. That's just what we're gonna get started with. So yeah, I'm gonna go over how to do the first assignment, but I'm just gonna stop the recording and do a separate recording for that.